So with us tonight, we have Dr. Richard Sonn, and he is a professor of history. All of our panelists tonight are from the University of Arkansas. And he is a professor of history, but you will find him engaging students in very in-depth ways around the history of, you'll have to help me, with the history of France and the Holocaust and gender studies and cultural, intellectual, arts, and sciences. And I'm going backwards. Toby Klein. We don't have doctor there yet, but she's a doctoral student here with public policy, excuse me. Dr. Jennifer Hoyer, and she's an associate professor of German and director of U of A Jewish Studies. And Dr. Carree Banton. She's associate professor of history and director of African and African American Studies. And our moderator tonight is Dr. Ryan Calabratta-Sajder. And he's associate professor of Italian and also, there's a few other things in here, and associate director of gender studies. And I'm just going to pass the baton to Ryan and let him take it from here. All of these folks may be familiar to you. They've spent time on this stage before, and we're happy to have them here tonight.
Thank you so much, Casey, and thank you everyone for coming out tonight. As Casey mentioned, I'm an Italian professor, so the U.S. really is not my thing. That's why they have me on this side of the table. So I will spread the word mostly for my colleagues to speak tonight. But thank you all for being here. We do encourage questions, and I open the floor up to my panel.
Well, I'll start.
Thank you, Richard.
It was good for me to see Peter Hayes, one of the historians featured in this presentation. Back in 2009, I took a 2-week seminar at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum from Peter Hayes called Teaching the Holocaust. And ever since then, I created a course that I'll be teaching this coming spring on the Holocaust. So Peter Hayes was an inspirational teacher. I recall some of the sayings he left us with. One very simple saying in 2 words: politics matters. Another, this was 13 years ago, so 2009, and interestingly, he said, for the first 30 years after the war, one could hardly see the Holocaust for the war. And in the last 30 years, you can hardly see the war for the Holocaust. As the study of the Holocaust emerged after about a generation. For the first 30 years, you didn't hear much about it, perhaps because survivors were going on with their lives and didn't really want to think or talk that much about it. And then the other thing I'll never forget, at the Holocaust Museum, coincidentally, they had an exhibition called Creating the Master Race, about Nazi eugenics and sterilization, and the infamous T4 program, where they started executing people who were declared life unworthy of life. And there were 6 of these killing centers in Germany. Of course, we know that all the death camps were in Poland, but there were 6 of these T4 killing centers in Germany, and one was outside Dresden in a castle called Schloss Sonnenstein, which was my family name. And so when I saw my name, which I always thought was a Jewish name, but apparently not only a Jewish name, it was obviously a castle named Sonnenstein, my mouth fell open because I'd never heard of that before. That had a personal impact. I think my father shortened our name before I was born. But not long after he came back from fighting in World War II, he shortened his name. And I'm not sure exactly why. So those are just some personal reflections. I was surprised watching the whole documentary, which I certainly recommend if you haven't seen it. They do not mention the Holocaust Museum in the documentary. There are a number of things they don't mention. I was struck by Ken Burns going pretty easy on President Roosevelt. He did a whole earlier documentary on FDR and the Roosevelts, and so he's very careful to deal with FDR. He could have been harsher, I thought, but he tries to be careful. Just a few thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Does anyone want to comment on anything that Richard mentioned? Okay, I'm going to go to Carree, Dr. Banton, for a moment. Can you explore a bit more with us some of the Jim Crow South thought processes that the Nazis had and what was happening here in the United States? You also mentioned in that brief clip that we saw you in that actually one was studying at the University of Arkansas.
Yes. Henry Krieger was a student who came over in interestingly, a study abroad program that the Germans devised to come and investigate the United States in all its eugenic, glory. And came to the South, as you all have seen in the film, and as I mentioned, they could have gone to a lot of places in the United States and not to exonerate the North, right? But the South, in a lot of ways, embodied the future that the Nazi wanted because of the deliberate ways post-Civil War Reconstruction in which Jim Crow had established itself here in ways to continue to dehumanize African Americans, to keep Native Americans as second-class citizens, right? To establish the whole separate but equal principle in law and in social practice here, right? So we all know the anti-miscegenation laws, right? That is based on ideas that if you marry and breed with people who you consider of a lesser race, that it will contaminate the blood of America, which, and the nation, in fact, which, white supremacists believe to be a white nation. The excluding, in spite of the 14th Amendment, the equal rights clause in that, to exclude African Americans from public life, separate schooling, separate social spaces, even cemeteries. And there were deliberate laws, black codes, that was put in the books here. And then that was reinforced in the South by extra legal violence, lynchings, as you guys saw in the video, where people showed up, dressed up, brought their children, dressed up in pretty dresses, to go and watch somebody burn and hang, and send back postcards to their family to say, look at, this is me on the right here. This is a token, a finger from the lynching that happened last Sunday that I've sent to you. And this was what was happening on the American landscape. And what strikes me, Ryan, in watching the film, I was curious about if no one asked the soldiers as they were looking at the horror when they came upon Auschwitz and Dachau and all of these different places, about, had they heard about lynchings? Had they read about it? Did they put these two things together in their minds as they're marveling at the horror that the Nazis had done, that they had left in their own country? So I was very curious about that, in terms of, we know that the capacity of Americans to be reflexive, it's not that, deep. But that's what I'm always curious about, because
that distance can create the mirage at all times. Like, look at what they're doing over there. That's why we celebrate Fulbright. He was for peace over there while he was creating hell for people here. And so that's what I wonder about.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I also loved your whole double V day. That was really,
Right. Mm-hmm.
really,
Yeah.
it was really, also when you know, that double metaphor.
Yeah.
Passing the word on to Professor Hoyer, how do we see some of these then Jim Crow South ideals manifest in the Nazi propaganda, in the periodization? Is there anything in particular that maybe the average person wouldn't have heard of or be aware of?
In the German propaganda,
Mm-hmm.
they, as far as I understood it, when Krieger came over, sent as study abroad mission, as you said, and learned this material, and then went back. I think the main takeaway was the Americans were very sloppy, and we can do it better. And so a lot of what you would see that we wouldn't necessarily easily connect with the Jim Crow South or the Black Codes, or, concentration camps also have a great deal in common with plantations. That was absolutely a Vorlage, something that they drew on when they created concentration camps, which, by the way, that was not new in the 1930s. They did that in Africa already in the 19th century. So this is not a new thing, and they've been borrowing ideas from American racism for a very long time. But they did it in such a way that I'm not really sure that if you are a student of the American, and the lack of reflexive thinking has a big, and I say this as someone who has taught the Holocaust at universities since the 90s, that it's not easy to see unless you are already looking to be aware of what's around you. And then you see that sign on the bench that says, Jews are not welcome here, to go, oh, wait a minute, we've seen that somewhere else, haven't we? And it's not like that's never been talked about. I mean, one of the books that that is often taught in German studies, Holocaust curricula, is a book that is, in German it's called Weiterleben. In English it's called Still Alive, written by a person called Ruth Kluger, who was a Germanist professor at Irvine. She passed away last year. She survived Auschwitz as a teenager. And she writes rather extensively in the English version of the book. It's not translated. She rewrote it for an American audience and wrote extensively about the Jim Crow South, and she referred to American students as Tom Sawyers. And whenever we got to that part of the book and I would start probing people to talk a little bit about why do you think she's using that? Where is that coming from? And they just did not want to talk about it. And it's hard to know how much of it is just, what I saw a lot of the time was it should be an easy connection. There is a sign that forbids you to sit here. There is a sign that forbids you to sit here. You can't get on that train. You can't get on that train. Don't drink from this fountain. Don't drink from that fountain. But we've been taught so much as white Americans, or white passing Americans, or racialized as white Americans, to see they're the bad guys. We don't do that here. It just conflicts with the narrative so badly that even if it's, once you start looking and you could actually recognize parallels, your brain shuts off. Nope, I can't. There's no parallel here. We're the good guys. They're the bad guys. And I don't know if that is a satisfactory answer to your question, but that is definitely what I have to say to it. Can I add one more thing, though? Because when you mentioned I was so hoping somebody would bring up the Double V for Victory campaign. No, but really, you guys, because I have studied the Holocaust for a very long time, and admittedly, German studies is a different thing from American studies. But in all of the stuff I read, the dissertation I wrote, the classes I sat in on, I never once heard about that until I went to the African American Cultural History Museum in Washington, D.C., and came across that and was absolutely enraged. I know there's a lot in the Holocaust to make you sad, there should be a lot that makes you angry. And some of it is what happened, and some of it is what we don't talk about. And that is one of the things that should absolutely outrage you, that we don't talk about the Double V for Victory campaign. It was short-lived. It was not terribly well known for very long among white audiences. And then it just disappeared into history. Thank you so much for bringing that up, because it's such a scandal that we don't talk about that more. That's me.
No, that was great. Thank you. Staying on the topic of teaching the Holocaust, all of my panelists have been very active in getting the bill passed. I know Toby Klein is one of the faces on campus that we always heard getting us to sign petitions. So moving on to Toby, how do we take a film like this or excerpts like this and try to make more folks aware in the K through 12 curriculum or even the college curriculum?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I'll also say I feel extremely underqualified to be here with someone who's on my committee who will be seeing if I pass my dissertation in a few months, but it's really humbling to be here. When it comes to Holocaust education, a lot of us can see what's on the screen and find it really jarring in a lot of different ways. We all have our own reactions to it. If you care about what's going on the screen, I highly encourage you to think about voting in every single election, and I know I'm probably speaking to a similar-minded audience here, but this year there was, in the same legislative session in which we passed mandating Holocaust education for the first time in the state of Arkansas for 5th through 12th graders, in that same time there were two other pieces of legislation, one that passed and one that didn't. The one that didn't pass lost by one vote in the Senate after being passed in the House, and that would have banned any conversations that made anyone feel uncomfortable based on the race, based on their race, gender, ethnicity. Essentially what this was is one of the plethora of anti-critical race theory bills that has been introduced that would have drastically limited the ability to teach this piece of legislation. So when you are seeing these kinds of things, I think it's important that we, especially here in Arkansas, think about local politics, remembering that a few votes in Arkansas really determine who runs for, really determine offices here. Remembering that that pieces of legislation that, again, would have really nullified the law, would have nearly made it impossible to teach the Holocaust, lost by one vote. And so every local election, Arkansas has a legislative session that meets once every 2 years. Every election really matters. I cannot encourage you enough to engage your legislators on topics like this and keep topics like this at the front of memory because our students don't know this information and I can't convey to them the gravity of this situation in a few short moments with them. There's nothing that can. It has to be implemented in our education system for a longer time than before they get to us at a university.
Okay, to my college colleagues, how do we teach critical race theory and the Holocaust? Do we take a comparative approach? Do we take it out of the canon? Do we do something like Jewish studies where it focuses on numerous aspects of the Jewish culture and we just insert it there? What is the best approach to discussing issues of the Holocaust?
I really do think that, I really do think that area studies programs are particularly primed to have these kinds of discussion because they are interdisciplinary in nature. And so you can get the history perspective, the policy perspective. And I do think that there needs to be more of a collaborative effort among these different.
Library patrons, the library will close in 30 minutes. Please be here making your final selection of library materials.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. Right, so, more kinds of collaborative, coalitional, kinds of occasions like this, where, as you said, the Jews practice this the Germans practice this in Africa, in their colonies. The Nama tribe in Namibia, They recently took the Germans to court in the United States, hoping to get reparations. They were there. The Germans, what they did to them, reduced their ethnic group to they were two of the largest ethnic groups in Namibia, and they were reduced to one of the fewest there. Buried them in the sand, killed them, took their land and buried them in the sand in an effort, the scramble for Africa and efforts to partition Africa and take African lands. Right? So those kinds of linkages, I think, would be particularly insightful and fruitful, right? We can think about the kinds of social death, right? We think about slavery as a kind of Holocaust, right? That happened, 12.5 million enslaved Africans perished, not counting the ones who were thrown to sharks in the Atlantic or died on the African side of the Atlantic, but perished on plantations that had made estimations that their life, it was worth it to work them to death for 3 to 4 years and then have the slave ship pull up so to fuel their capitalist enterprise, right? So those kinds of, I think, they're critical insight that can be gained by looking at these two experiences side by side. We've talked about the laws, how Hitler borrowed from the United States what it was, what it had enacted here in order, and said that we could do it better. You know, we could master this, right? So I do think, you know, area studies and having these kinds of cross-disciplinary conversations, I think can produce more insight. We can break down the national barriers, pretty much like Ken Burns did in the film, right, where we're not seeing it as Germany, right, but we're seeing it as an idea that is not contained within any one space and that has been borrowed after executing it on one set of people, right, Native Americans, Trail of Tears, boarding schools, sterilization, all of those kinds of things. So I think they're insights that we can get.
Another comparison is that Hitler's ideal was Lebensraum, expanding Germany to the east, but he was copying Manifest Destiny, that America was expanding to the west, putting Native Americans on reservations. Hitler thought that was a great idea, and he would do the same thing to expand greater Germany, that we were getting to have greater America. The eugenics policies, we were at the forefront of eugenics thought. And in 1905, the Germans copied it. They called it more malevolently race hygiene, but it was the same idea. And so it always had that racial meaning for the Germans, which of course it did to some degree here.
One thing I will add is that I think what everyone here is speaking to is that this matters in context, right? We can't look at these events without context. And what concerns are emerging, especially when it comes to, again, I'm a policy nerd, and so I love policy, but what the concern is that we are seeing attacks on education policy that determine our ability to tell to tell history, right? To teach history to folks, and it all matters in context. And removal of key contextual pieces is really, really dangerous, and that's a concern that I have. I think a few of us share it.
Let me just cap that all off then also by saying that for a very long time in Holocaust education, there was this sense that the Holocaust existed in its own kind of little abyss, and it didn't have anything to do with anything else. Maybe the Second World War, but that was it. It was otherwise, it was its own kind of vacuum, and it isn't. And that's, like, I taught this class last year. One of the people who was in it was there. And it was called How Did the Holocaust Affect? And then we filled in the blank every week with how the Holocaust affected every area of study you can think of. We only did like 8 to start because it was just well, let's see how this goes. But there is really almost nothing that you can look at that it doesn't touch somehow, which just underscores how little you can cut it off from everything else. And like, we haven't really talked too much about disability studies yet this evening, but there's a whole movement of neurodiversity that has direct connection to like the T4 experiments, for example, right? Or the idea of like Asperger's autism was absolutely connected to this. And you know, there was like, we don't want to talk about this from too many different points of view. There are, those points of view matter. They're all connected to this thing. And I always tell my students, I will always come at this from a Jewish studies perspective first. That is always where I come from. But that doesn't mean that we can't talk about other things, because Jewish studies is also connected to a lot of other things. And we're not doing anybody any favors if we just look at the Holocaust in this vacuum. We have to look at what it affected afterwards. We also have to look at where it came from. Mm-hmm. And that means we have to talk about the United States and a lot of other places too. But the United States is not scot-free. And that's a difficult thing to teach. It was something it was like taboo. You weren't supposed to talk about that for a really long time. And what I found from the students last year was they want to talk about it. They are ready. It is time. So contextualized, connections, in area studies, I think collaborative, that's definitely what we have to do.
Thank you for the,
Can I say
yes, absolutely.
I just want to, linger on the point that you made, Toby, about if we're thinking about this going forward and the fact that the Holocaust Studies bill passed and the critical race theory bill failed, right? And what the meaning of that is, as we're thinking about, issues of race, even as it connects to the Holocaust in the present day, right? To think about that, right? This idea that wokeness and critical race theory, that, we saw Whoopi Goldberg got in trouble the other day, and people forget that the Jews have been thought about as a separate race, right? That they've been persecuted. And what you've said about white passing, right, and how that affects policy now, right, where certain segments of our legislature identify as Judeo-Christian, right, and they can use that to excuse, certain aspects of race that have experienced atrocity while penalizing others, So I do think that is a particular, it's like, what did they do? What? They passed the Holocaust bill but failed the critical race theory, even though, this is a conversation going on around town. And it's like, that's a point for us all to ponder about what the meaning of that is, given that, all of these groups have experienced difficulties and difficult history, and how the United States see themselves in these two histories, Holocaust history as opposed to African American history, and the efforts to hide one as well and promote the other.
I have a follow-up, Professor Hoyer. Also, as a German instructor, you've taught the Holocaust in numerous ways, I imagine, in numerous languages and also diverse levels. What are some difficulties bringing it into the language classroom? And I guess I'm sure there's plenty of positives, but I'm curious about some of the difficulty of talking about the Holocaust as a German studies faculty.
One of the immediate ones that jumps to mind is that I have had more than once overtly white supremacist students who want to learn German because it was a language that they associate with National Socialism, and that's something they adhere to. And if you've got somebody like that sitting in the room, I welcome it when they're much more forward about it, because that usually becomes a conversation. If it's a lot less, if it's more underspoken, then that can turn up in their homework, which becomes really uncomfortable pretty fast. And then, it becomes an issue depending on what campus you're on, what university you teach at, how you're supposed to deal with that. So that's one thing. I often can't teach the Holocaust in German because it's kind of its own not language, it's its own, like you really need a high level of German to be able to do that. However, I think it's becoming more possible because for a long time there weren't a lot of texts in German about this topic that were accessible to anybody who wasn't a scholar. And a lot of the stuff that was then available, that was literature, there weren't a lot of films because Germans they confront this topic like nobody else. I mean, like, we are not confronted with our own atrocities in this country the way that German students are confronted with theirs constantly. They learn about it in school at every level. They learn about it on the street every day. They learn about it in the museums everywhere. But that means that they also they have a hard time knowing how to put it into some kind of presentational mode, like what kind of pictures can you use? Can you make films about this? What are you allowed to write? But increasingly now there are more and more kinds of texts that you can use that are in German that are accessible to people at a lower learning level, and so I think it's becoming more possible to teach that in German. I'm trying to think what other issues that one may have had. Oh well, okay. Similar to the first thing that I mentioned, there is an actual dictionary of a thing called Nazi German. It is its own kind of bureaucratic language. And while if you're teaching this in English, you can give people the German terms, but there are lots of English terms. But if you're talking about it in German, you end up having to use the German terms. And that can be uncomfortable fast. Because some of those terms are still they're like part of normal everyday German, and people don't necessarily realize that that's a Nazi word, which is an important learning experience. But but it's not an easy thing to confront in the classroom, and the language lesson can very quickly then become not that, which is important. It's
Absolutely.
important to have those lessons, but those are a handful of
No, those are
answers.
lovely. I teach a class on Jews, fascism and Jews of the Italian Holocaust in English, because it's much more accessible, and also it then would attract Jewish studies students. But the literature in Italian is accessible. It's more the history and the criticism that I think is very difficult for the undergraduates, especially. Moving on to the film, The U.S. and the Holocaust by Burns, Novak, and Botstein. When I teach film often. We always talk about how even a documentary film has a perspective, right? And nothing is truly objective. And Richard already kind of started this, the answer to my question that's coming, but we'll start back with him. So my question is, are there moments of the documentary as a whole, I think all of you have seen it as a whole, or even in the moments that we've seen tonight, that we feel are weak, could have been expanded upon better, a narrative that maybe was left out, or could have been stronger according to your perspectives? Obviously we all bring with us to the table our own disciplines, right? So we also are looking for certain things. So I'd like to start with Richard, and then we'll just come on down the road.
Well, the film emphasizes that people in the U.S. State Department, and most notoriously a guy named Breckinridge Long, were quite virulent anti-Semites. And so one wants to ask, why didn't President Roosevelt fire these guys? But which he never did. They remained there all the way through. Later on, Deborah Lipstadt, I think it is, raises the point about why didn't the Army Air Force bomb Auschwitz. Airplanes came within a few miles of Auschwitz on the way to bomb military targets, but Auschwitz was not deemed a military target, and so they did not bomb the gas chambers, but they could have if they'd wanted to. And she makes the point this was a moral issue that they should have made and they should have bombed. On the other hand, they do suggest that FDR did create the War Refugee Board early in 1944, which did begin the process of saving at least some Jews, although by that time 5 million Jews were already dead, so a little late. But there are some heroes they look for, Morgenthau, and then this John Pelly, this fairly minor official in the Treasury Department who did step out and do things to combat the State Department's blindness. So they try to give this careful mixed bag, but there are some things that certainly could have been done. And I mean, this has been called the greatest blot on FDR's reputation. So they deal with it quite carefully in the documentary.
Thank you, Richard. Toby?
I'm in no position to offer any critique on anyone right now, so thank you.
Jennifer?
We have a train. Because I'm not a historian, and I'm not an Americanist, and so I am somewhat ill-qualified to talk about the documentary from any kind of perspective like that. What I feel like got brought up in it probably could have come up more, because it was actually such a huge issue, is in the aftermath, by which I really mean after the camps had been liberated, because the Holocaust in some ways never ended, meant like psychologically, politically in some ways too. The Holocaust didn't really end. The issue of trying to talk about it. I'm a literature scholar primarily, and that is, if you study the way people tried to write about the Holocaust, already starting in 1945, it becomes something that drives a lot of literary study around the world for the next 50 years. How do you talk about this? Are you allowed to write poems about it? Are you allowed to write articles about it? Are you allowed to write poems after it? Are you allowed to make films? What can you do? Who's allowed to say what? And while I think Deborah Lipstadt and I think now Levin Painter and I think there's one other person who kind of gets to the question of this thing that happened requires people to confront everything about what they thought good and bad were, about what humanity is, about what we thought human history was about. And nowhere is that clearer than in any kind of art form that comes after 1945, where people are seriously having knockdown, drag-out fights about whether you're allowed to write about this thing. Can you put this into words? Is it possible to ever find a word to describe what you experienced in Auschwitz? The only person who can really understand what you experienced in Auschwitz was somebody who was in Auschwitz. This is not me telling you this. This is me telling you what people said. And there was even for 10, 20 years, there was this very much like Auschwitz lies outside of speech. I think this was, I'll try to come up with the name of the person who said this originally, but Auschwitz lies outside of speech just as it lies outside of reason. And if we can ever find a reason for it, then we've lost everything. And while that makes total sense to say, I think it also lets people off the hook a little bit too easily. Because then what? We don't write about it? That's a problem too. So that's maybe a little bit more than you can actually get into in a documentary. But at least it was touched on, and I would have liked to have seen that touched on a bit more. But one other thing that I do, if you haven't seen the whole thing, I just want to point out a moment that I really liked in the third part. This is Deborah Lipstadt, who talks about Anne Frank's diary, because this text occupies such a central part of the Holocaust education curriculum, and why people like it so much. I mean, its first version was edited because, as you were saying, everything that is published has some kind of a point of view, and her father was nervous about the way she would be perceived, and so he edited the diary to a certain extent. And Deborah Lipstadt's point is people like to read this diary. It's an excellent diary. There is a lot of good stuff in it. But there is no gassing, nobody dies, and there are no Nazis until the very end. That's not the story of the Holocaust. I was like, oh, she said that.
Out loud.
Out loud. And that's actually a thing that has been said in, if you do Holocaust studies, that is something we talk about a lot. Like, what texts do we use? Why do we use those texts? And don't some of them maybe sugarcoat things or talk about aspects of it that you can see just enough of the terribleness to walk away from it feeling like you're a better person or like you are very sad, but never having to confront any of the really deep, dark issues that are very much a part of this.
What comes to mind is at one point in my 9 years here, we've, it feels like I but with Jewish studies, we screen, and the temple, we screened La Vita è Bella, right? Life is Beautiful. And the first question, of course, every time after the movie is, doesn't it sugarcoat things too much? You know, what is the point? Et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, and if you've seen the movie, everyone loves the movie, but scholars are always looking for a bit more. So, Carree?
Right. And it brings to mind the boy in the striped
Pajamas.
pajamas too. It's, you know, the juxtaposition of the kinds of things the United States bans, right? Why is this? You know, again, I don't understand why the U.S. has all this great military might, but it thinks its people so fragile that they cannot confront things. You know, so that they have to sugarcoat and put a screen and veneer and a veil over things in order to make it palatable, you know, so that people are not confronting horror and atrocity. And, you know, if it's one thing that particular groups of people can teach the United States, people in the United States, it's that kind of resilience and drive, right? That comes from having these experiences, but we're confronted with, we can't even talk about it in classrooms, you know, and we perpetuate the same kind of a thing. But going on to the film, again, as I said, I wish there was a little bit more reflexivity. I wish that we had brought it up to think more deeply about how we continue to do those kinds of things. You know, we can identify in every era, you know, how the United States have ignored atrocities, whether it's Rwanda, whether it's Haiti, whether it's, you know, some of the things that happened in Latin America. And I wonder if a part of why they couldn't make that kind of juxtaposition, right, having come from the United States and then seeing bodies strewn about like that, and maybe have heard about lynching and bodies strewn about like that, if they have in their mind, there's some people who deserve that, and then some people who don't. Like the narrative of one country services the kinds of who deserves humanity and who does not. On the German side, it was the Jewish people don't deserve humanity, right? And on the American side, Native American people don't deserve humanity. African Americans don't deserve humanity. So you cannot make those kinds of linkages, right? Because it's happening in two separate nationalistic narratives. So I wonder about that. But we think about current immigration laws, right? We had the Chinese Exclusion Act, and we've had quotas until 1965, the Hart-Celler Immigration Act. And even in recent times, you know, Haitians trying to migrate to the United States, and they're pushed out. They're left to die in Europe, right? To suffer in Europe or down at the southern border. And we have shipped so much money in aid to other people who we consider worthy, right? Or to let in and bring in immigrants who we consider worthy. So we still have that race problem that define how the United States treated Jews in the Holocaust, and we're still having that issue up until present time.
Okay, thank you. Before we open it up to questions, my last question for the panel is, on the flip side, what is one takeaway that we can that we've learned from the film that we can bring back to the classroom? One thing that we really think exemplifies, you know, what's missing in Holocaust education, something, you know, one of the strengths of the film.
One reason this film is different from every previous Ken Burns documentary is the last 10 minutes, he does bring it up to recent events. I don't think he's ever done that before. So he does show Charlottesville and Trump building his wall and all that. So he does make it pretty explicit what he's talking about, which I was impressed by. I'm sure that'll be the most controversial aspect of the whole film. Some people will really not like that. He did that, but he did it. I thought that was brave of him.
So one of my favorite Holocaust museums is, of course, Yad Vashem in Israel, and one of the reasons that I really appreciate that museum is the intentionality to how we tell stories, which I think is, of course, important in Holocaust education, but especially with this documentary and the series. And again, if you haven't seen it, really encourage you to. Is the way, one of the things that the museum does really well is that there's always little pockets of information. Specifically, at the museum itself, there are drawers that you can pull out, and for me, I love it because it's very sensory friendly. And you can pull it out, and like many museums, you can pull out different pockets of information. And one thing that I really appreciated about this film and the way that it was intentionally streamed together is that you don't get one, traditionally, we get one narrative at a time. Like everyone has said, oftentimes they're digestible narratives. They're more convenient, they're easier for us to understand, right? And us versus them, it's something that makes it simple for us to understand and digest. But this film specifically, the series, I guess, really did a great job of intermixing little pockets of information and stories combined in narrative. Yeah, I really appreciated it.
Okay, thank you. Jen?
I feel like I've kind of already answered that question, but I'll tack on one thing at the to what I've already said about some of the moments that I quite like about this. We actually get footage of a service happening in a concentration camp. It's afterwards, but this focuses on Jewish life. And while on the one hand, we want to be careful about narratives that sugarcoat and focus more on sort of, if there can be such a thing, positive aspects, the flip side of that is that it tends to be viewed as like the Jews are gone. Right? There's even a book called People Love Dead Jews. Have you heard of this? It's Dara Horn. I think you're reading it even in the community this year. That it tends to be this thing like that's a sad thing that happened and it's all in the past, and Jewish life, we don't know anything about it unless it happens to be your life. There is actually a focus in there also on Jewish life after the liberation, and that I think also needs to be underscored, that there is the possibility to go back and reclaim space, to have a positive reclaiming of space from the group of people who were the most massively targeted by the Nazi regime.
I'll just highlight 2 points. I love seeing the narrative from the perspective of children, right, through a child's eyes. I think that was particularly poignant. And, you know, any day that people can call out the hypocrisy of the United States, I always think that's great.
Okay, questions from the audience. I think they want you to use the microphone. Is that correct? So if you don't mind coming up to the center, because we're recording.
There's a group that, I guess I need to turn this on somehow.
No, it's on.
It's on, okay. There's a group that we didn't talk about tonight that I think is understudied, and you talk about the effect and the of the law after the Holocaust, and that is the gay community. And I'm gay, and I've tried to study this as much. The Mattachine Society, of course, was there. And something called paragraph 175 was still used up through, 1969 at least, to identify gay men and arrest them often. And then you talk about how about that in the United States? What happened in the United States so often happened here in Fayetteville for a long time, and they would entrap gay men in the public parks and ruin their lives. But it was still left over for that persecution because of who they were. The difference that I see in this is if you were persecuted for race, a lot of times your parents were there, your church was there, there was a family there. If you were persecuted because of your faith, there was an extended group there. But the gay men were often alone. They were out. The Medellin Society is an exception because I'm sure there were other ones like that where there was an underground and they knew. But when you're pushed underground and then you're vilified and it's left over still from that same type of attitude, I think that that's something that we don't talk about a lot. And there needs to be that inclusion in this discussion because it lingered also. And you talked about the the Holocaust, and the Holocaust and the pink triangle, I think, is equally as important. And that also so much affects the gays in the United States because they had the same type of prejudice against them. But again, what I see as most different is they didn't have a community behind them. And anyway, I wanted to just bring that up and see if you had any thoughts on that.
I would like to respond first, if you don't mind, as a gay man who runs the Italian program here. I will say with this panel in particular, we've talked about these topics actually a lot. And in my courses, when I teach these Italian film courses, they're always cross-listed with gender studies, actually. So when I teach it about the Holocaust, it's also cross-listed with Jewish studies. But so these are topics that we talk about. I actually just showed Una Giornata Particolare yesterday to my class, and we will, a special day, and we will talk about the aspects of both, gender, Judaism, and fascism when we analyze the film next week. Oftentimes, I'm the person who actually asks that question at these events. So it is something that we do talk about. I have not seen the entire film, so I don't know if the film addresses any of that. I'm curious. Okay. So, but I will say that at least at the U of A campus, we do talk about these kinds of topics. And actually, I was a guest speaker in Professor Hoyer's class, and I was the first talk, and we did bring up, issues of LGBTQ Judaism in Italy, because that's only my field. So, but I will open the floor to my colleagues.
I want this one. Okay, I actually have something to say on this one. So one of the reasons that I actually know Dr. Calabratta-Sajder is because of something that I think we've spoken about, which is intersectionality of this and why it's important that we talk about, like what you talk about the LGBTQ community and the Holocaust. It's incredibly important that intersectional connection is made. And so Dr. Calabratta-Sajder and I actually brought LGBTQ graduation to the University of Arkansas. We were the last school in the SEC to have a graduation celebrating LGBTQ students. And in 2019, that was our, sure. That was our, was it 18? Okay.
Before the COVID.
Yeah.
Before the Rona, before that. We had one in person, yeah, okay. So at least within the last 4 or 5 years, graduation has come here, and every year we make a point to talk about the symbolism. And if you want an author, I can't recommend Danny Cohen enough. It's phenomenal. Dr. Cohen's phenomenal. I think he's at Northwestern still?
I think so.
Yeah, phenomenal. Happy to recommend and lend you a few books. But I do think it's important that we talk about these things and we name them. So at every Lavender graduation that we've had, we mention and we acknowledge the importance of lavender and the importance of acknowledging that it was a lesbian woman, descendant of Holocaust survivors, who started the first lavender graduation at the University of Michigan, and drawing in that intersectionality. So it's not just Jewish study scholars or anyone that is learning about this, but rather that we bring it into our events and we talk about the symbolism and why we have that lavender color and what that means and what that symbolism means to Americans, to American LGBTQ folks who are experiencing discrimination in different ways, but still experiencing discrimination.
Peter Hayes, the professor I had at the Holocaust Museum, was one of the historians featured here. He's Irish Catholic, and so some people were wondering, why are you doing it? But he is gay. He told us he was gay, and that was part of his his motivation, but he was, and the pink triangle and all that, but he was reluctant to equate persecution of homosexuals by the Nazis with those of Jews. He said, how can you compare, I think the figure was 10,000 homosexuals to 6 million? So he was hesitant to go, I mean, yes, he was certainly cognizant of it, but he was hesitant to go too far with that comparison.
Thank you, Jen.
And yet, one of the reasons that I think we do always need to bring that into the conversation is because a lot of the groups of people who were targeted who were not Jews were used as trial subjects. They would do things to other people to see if that would, you know, make some kind of a difference. They tried their punishments first on others before they would try them on the Jews. But also, they had a special kind of way of dealing with what they considered to be asocial or sexually abhorrent people. And, you know, gay men were absolutely targeted and outlawed well before the Nazi era for essentially misusing their bodies. Gay women didn't matter to them. And as somebody who also identifies that way, that is an issue for me too. But what I would like to also add to that was, like, they would devise particular ways of torturing gays and lesbians that targeted sex specifically. And so reasons that gay men in particular didn't speak out until much later was that there was really a certain amount of sexual assault shame that was associated with the kinds of things that happened to them. And women who are gay and not gay were raped in the camps, outside the camps, and even with, this happened between inmates in camps too. And that was a topic that only got brought up. I think the first time I saw that brought up was in Tablet magazine 3 years ago. 3. But also the issue of memorializing. They only just recently in Berlin established a memorial for the homosexual victims of the Nazi regime. And sort of every year it seems like they kind of flesh that out a little bit more, and they'll put different markers. Happened to notice this summer when I was walking along the river. And there are different places throughout Berlin where they've now set up kind of markers to let you know, like, so-and-so, because Berlin was a gay mecca. And so they've got different placards and statues and things all over the city that say so-and-so lived here, they were known for being an activist in the gay community and tortured by the Nazis or left Germany or whatever. So it's like that memorialization is increasing, but it's lagging way behind. And it's for reasons other than political persecution. It's also just people being closeted and not wanting to talk about what happened to them. So there's another aspect of that. There was less of a community behind them, and that persists, I think.
Other questions, please.
Okay, I would like to throw 2 other groups into the mix. There were a small pocket of Afro-Germans called Rhineland Bastards. And does anybody know what happened to the Rhineland Bastards? I know they were sterilized, and as Dr. Hoyer mentioned, a lot of the punishments, like sterilization, were practiced on these Afro-Germans. They were actually products of relations between German women and African troops installed in Germany during World War I. Is that correct, Dr. Hoyer? And then the Roma. I don't think you can say gypsy anymore, but are there any records of any of these people being allowed to immigrate to the United States? I mean, I haven't seen the entire documentary, but I just know after you heard about the sterilizations of the Afro-Germans, they kind of disappeared. And recently someone made a movie about an Afro-German girl being sterilized, but there's nothing else about the Afro-Germans. And then the Roma people. I mean, I know Jewish organizations advocated for Jewish immigration, but what about the Roma?
First, can you share the title of the film that you were referring to?
I have to Google it.
Oh, okay.
Unfortunately, I don't have any information on whether or not Roma and Sinti people were allowed to emigrate. That is definitely a historian's question. But yes, so the Afrodeutsche community. So there is and I actually also need to look up the English title. There is an autobiography written by one of the Afro. I'm not sure if he was I hate saying the term Rhineland bastard. I'm very sorry, but his name was Hans-Jörg Massaquoi, and I need to look up what the English title of his autobiography was. But he was born in Germany during the Third Reich, and was targeted by the Nazis, and was in school. And there was another person though whose name I'd have to look up. I'm not sure because I only just learned about this summer. But I'm so glad you brought that up because Afrodeutsche were also incarcerated in concentration camps, and you rarely see anything about that because I think it's just understudied. I'm not really sure how to. I mean, there's no justifying it. It's not justifiable, but that did happen. But also, just like you were talking about with the Nama tribe and the trial that happened, they actually there has been such an increase in the last 2 years or something on films, documentaries, books, museums, talking about the Afro-German community that has existed since the 17th century. So the idea that Germans are essentially white is a fiction too. I know, right? But yes, that is definitely something that doesn't get talked about. They were also Afrodeutsche were also incarcerated in camps. Let me look up the name of the book about Hans-Jörg Massaquoi.
Oh, the title of the movie is Where Hands Touch.
And the director?
Oh, I got to go back to Google. But there's also another book, one of the concentration camps. He was in Schindler's List. He was the one shooting the people. The book is titled My Grandfather Would Have Shot Me. And the author is half African and she's half German. And her grandfather was, he was the guy that was shooting everybody in Schindler's List. Armand, oh gosh, I can't think of his last name. But yeah, thank you, Dr. Hoyer, because really you don't hear a lot about the Afro-Germans. And I found out by accident. I accidentally stumbled across some information and I was like, woo, but the movie is Where Hands Touch.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Something I'd like to have seen more addressed is in history male dominance, not just white supremacists, which is a concern to me greatly, but you go back into history of all the various religions, and most of them were the male dominant traditions. So I know that my generation, unfortunately, the whole thing of you're not a man if you don't fight, aren't strong. And then look what's happened with women throughout history. So, I mean, things are improving in some ways, but this male dominance has taken a while to go away a bit, not completely, but that you got all these different cultures involved with their male dominance. And media, quite frankly, in my opinion, encourages the worst of things in so many ways that we aren't addressing. And as a child, that I was known for bringing up the things, ugly things that people didn't want to talk about. So I wasn't very popular in very many places. But the Nazi thing I saw when I was a little girl on the TV with the bodies being shot and going into the ditches, and my whole life is pursued trying to understand how that happened. I pursued psychology, etc. But you go into those that don't even want to look at reality. And that's a huge problem. Huge problem. And so you don't get that many that want to even learn about history and the horrible things that are happening and how to start to prevent them. And quite frankly, I think there's more that needs to be done in the field of psychology.
I have a response to the male dominance issue. When I first came across the name Heinrich Krieger, this Nazi who was at U of A in 1933-34, I was thinking, who am I thinking of? I've seen that name before. But I was thinking of Heinrich Kramer, who was the author of the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. This was a German Dominican who back in 1486, I think, wrote this path-breaking book that identified this great danger of witchcraft all over Europe, and then Europeans started persecuting witches, primarily women. And that struck me, well, that's an interesting coincidence. Then it occurred to me there's a powerful parallel there. That the persecution of witches, persecution of Jews are equally unreal or bizarre. And of course, everybody can see that the persecution of witches is a little odd. But in the 20th century, it did not seem odd to persecute Jews. So persecution can take many, many forms.
So one of the uglier things that we don't talk about in the Holocaust, specifically relating to gender, is the cruelty in which it was assumptions about gender were made. And so one of the first things that I think of are structures that are built specifically. One of the first structures that was built for Nazi troops was where the camp prostitutes, essentially, were the women who were required to service men. And there's been some recent great literature that's coming out specifically exploring 2 lesbian women who were recruited to serve as sex slaves for the entire Nazi camp. And so from the get-go, and they're talking about barracks for German troops, right from the get-go, they're talking about how they can use women right off the bat. And so understanding gender is a key point of this. And also when we're talking about the Holocaust, it's not something that they want to bring up right up front, but it is a really key and oftentimes under talked about part, largely because it comes into controversies with sex, topics of that nature, things that we're not able to talk about regularly, right? Rape, these kinds of things that we know are a part of these larger tragedies that we don't have language, or that we don't have the ability to discuss right now.
There are 2 other aspects that I want to throw in there real fast. First of all, that you weren't allowed to talk about the Holocaust in a gendered way until maybe 10, 15 years ago. In the 90s, when you tried to bring gender into the discussion, especially if you're talking about camps, like it was okay to say that there were men's camps and women's camps, but other than that, it was that you weren't supposed to talk about that those 2 things were very different. It was just there was suffering and there were Jews suffering, and that was it. It didn't matter if they were men or women. But it did matter if they were men or women. They were tortured in different ways depending on their gender expectations. So there's that. The other thing that is maybe even more taboo than that, there was a book that was published in German studies, probably in the late 80s, that dealt with the homoeroticism that was a part of most Nazi art, if you can call it art. They really were hyper-fixated on the male body, and they depicted it in a way that was meant to really overemphasize the physical attributes of the sort of the beauty of the face, the clean cut, the hair, the muscles, they're well trained, they're fit, they eat vegetables, they work out, they don't smoke, they don't drink, and the uniforms. And there was a certain amount of discourse in the late 80s, I think early 90s, that dealt with the very kind of overt and yet somehow very not okay homoeroticism of the Nazi aesthetic. And a number of early Nazi adherents were members of the gay community until the persecution began, and then they jumped ship after that. But that's a very uncomfortable conversation to do with gender that's in there as well. Toxic masculinity, but through it in a homoerotic lens. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Hoyer. Just to respond very briefly to your earlier comment, I do believe that the new generation, the younger generation, is actually much more open to gender identities, to sexuality, to orientation. So I hope the whole divide between the binary of male and female will also at least move in a positive direction with this next generation. And this is coming from someone who's a realist, so I have a good vibe. So, because usually I'm on the negative side of things. But I believe it's the bewitching hour. The library is already closed. So first and foremost, oh, is there one more question? Is there time for one more question? Sure, please.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to take you guys out through the front, through the side door, so you can't get back into the building. Go
Are you sure?
around the library, down.
There's one thing about something
Jennifer.
Jen Hoyer.
mentioned about, I have a good friend in Germany, her name's Beata, and she told me that from a very early age, Holocaust was crammed down their throats every day in schools.
Yes.
So she was feeling extremely guilty and pissed off about being made extremely guilty.
Yes.
Is there a way that we can talk about our stories, our histories, that not approaching it, it's not going to come from a guilt angle? And how do we balance that? You know, maybe that's some of the problem with critical race, that we're going to make people feel guilty about something. Is there a way that these things can be talked about and taught that doesn't come from that angle?
It doesn't come from guilt.
Will you repeat his question? He wasn't close enough to the
I'm
mic.
sorry.
So the question, please correct me if I don't have this right, that is, so you've got a friend Beate in Germany who was
Grew up.
learning about the Holocaust all the time as a child.
Not learning about it, I think she had
Confronted with it.
Yes.
Okay. And it was so omnipresent, but it was always very guilt. It's your fault. This is your guys' fault. You did this.
She was feeling the guilt. I don't
Yeah.
know if they made her, I don't know if that was their fault.
But she's made to feel that
That's-
way.
Yeah, that's what, yes.
Okay. And your question is there a way that we can talk about this? Is there, for Germans in particular, I suppose, but anybody
Well,
who is, I mean, we're complicit too. Is there a way to talk about it that does not originate from guilt?
Is guilt built in?
Guilt built in. I think guilt is built in. I don't think there is a way to do that without the negative feeling. We have to sit with the discomfort because there's no way around that but through. And I think that's, we tend to privilege people's comfort a little more than is strictly helpful for this kind of a discussion. There's really no way around it. I mean, it's a terrible thing. People did it, and it wasn't like some magical force that did it. Humans did it. Humans did it to other humans. There's no way to make that feel good. It only hurts. But we're never going to get to a point where we could talk about how we go on if we can't sit with that guilt and work through it. But then I think the point is fair, though, because especially, I know this from teaching German students in Germany, that if you have only that and no other discussion that comes out of it,
Maybe that was the problem.
all that happens is that you feel the guilt, and you feel angry, and you feel like, what do you do with that? I think that's what's lacking.
You feel helpless. You feel helpless. And I do think, as I mentioned earlier, again, the reason why this can be so paralyzing, first of all, we don't talk about it. So it creates this cycle, right? We don't talk about it, so once it comes around again, you're bombarded with feelings, and then you haven't built up enough tolerance because you haven't confronted it enough. You don't have the language, the vocabulary to really navigate around it, and you're left with only guilt, right? And you feel this sense of powerlessness. And
The purpose of talking about is not creating guilt, I'm hoping.
I don't think, I mean, when these things are discussed, I don't think the end goal is guilt. When I show Yeah, it's a byproduct, and I often think, to be honest with you, one of the reasons it's because I think white people tend to center themselves and they cannot decenter. Like, this is about Jewish suffering, right? And I think white people can see themselves in the people who liberate. Why do they see themselves in the people committing the atrocity and then feel this guilt, right? When I teach abolition, I'm like, oh my God, look at John Brown, right? Look at William Lloyd Garrison. Why aren't people like, oh, wow, I want to be like that? This is my people. I come from these lines of abolitionists, Quakers and all these people who fought for the abolition of slavery, but they get caught up with the perpetrator, and I feel guilty. So I think it's a question also of ignorance, and because we have legislative enactment that are hampered by this same white guilt, that hamper policy so people cannot confront the history, and we don't build up that muscle, right? I'm a tennis player, so this hand is bigger than the other one, right? So we don't have that muscle and that tolerance to really talk about things, and so it produces that kind of inertia, and we're stuck, and we don't go anywhere.
And I think another concern we also have to remember is memory and trauma are selective, right? And I don't want to conclude on a negative note, but I guess I'm going to. We looked at the election, right, in Italy very recently of the first female prime minister who was a registered member of the Fascist Party when she was very young. So, I do think we really need to keep pushing forward with the education. One of the most important scholars in Italian cinema has a book on the representation of Jews in Italian cinema, and her whole thesis is, Italians have a selective memory. They don't want to embrace the past because the memory is traumatic. So they'd rather leave it aside. So I think on that note, though, first and foremost, we'd like to thank the audience for your participation. Thank you for the questions. Our friends at the Fayetteville Public Library, who are ready for us to go home. Our friends at PBS Arkansas. And last but not least, my panel of amazing scholars and critical thinkers.